Good afternoon, everyone. Hello again. Thanks so much for joining us for what's been a brilliant day full of inspiration and insights, courtesy of my wonderful colleagues and the great guest speakers we've had on. I'm Jem Topcam. I'm the head of copy and content here at Net Natives. I'm based in Brighton over in the UK, where I work in the creative team alongside some super talented people. I've been at the company for around 4.5 years now, and in that time, one of the most exciting developments for me personally has been our expansion into the US market. I've been lucky enough to work alongside some really awesome clients on your side of the pond, some of which we'll touch on in a little while, and I'm super stoked to be part of the first ever US Think Student Live event. I'm just going to share my slides now. Cool. So today I'm going to talk to you about communicating your value proposition and the importance of standing out in what's an increasingly competitive and constantly changing environment. So there are so many moving parts at play here and so many things to consider. So I'm going to try and break it all down into these 4 sections. Okay, so the what, the why, the when, and the how. So when we're talking about the what, we're talking about really the ingredients that go into a value proposition. What makes a really killer value proposition? As we discuss the why, we'll talk about your audience and your competitors and how fierce competition is. When we talk about the when, we're talking about when you should communicate your value proposition, so reactive versus proactive, when it's appropriate to align your values with conversations happening in the wider culture, and how you can do so in a way that's not only in good taste, but also believable and adds value for your students. And finally, my favorite as a copywriter, the how. So here we'll look at how a well-defined tone of voice and visual identity are some of the most effective tools for communicating your value proposition, and the importance of being consistent as well across both of those things. So what's in a value proposition? As you're all marketers or you're involved with your institution's brand proposition, you'll have a pretty good idea of what a value proposition actually looks like. You'll probably know your own brands like the back of your hands. But here's a dictionary definition. An innovation, service, or feature intended to make a company or product attractive to customers. Quite bland, pretty straightforward, and I think it actually undersells the importance of a value proposition. I think we can do better, and I think we can go a bit bigger than this. Your value proposition really is the living, breathing thing that underpins everything you do and say. That might seem lofty, it might feel like we're kind of over-egging it a little bit here, but to me, this is how a value proposition needs to be treated. It needs to inform everything you do at every touch point for a potential student, from the moment they consider going to college to the moment they graduate, and ideally long after that as well. If we break it down a little bit further, your value proposition is made up of lots of moving parts, as I said, and it all starts really with your people. This could mean the kinds of people your students learn from, so the esteemed academics, the inspirational guest lecturers, or it could mean their peers, fellow students, the makeup of the cohort, if it's an international cohort. What are the benefits of that to a student in terms of broadening their perspective? Or it could mean the kind of atmosphere you try and foster within that cohort. Is the atmosphere inclusive? Is it supportive? Then there's places. So location is a big one for us. New York City, for example, is a huge pool for students, and it's so fun to write about. But then on the other side of the coin, we have clients like David Eccles School of Business down in Utah, and capturing the kind of the beauty and the majesty of the environment down there in Utah with the mountains as your backdrop. These are pictures that we in the creative team really love painting through our words and through our visuals. And it's something you should definitely consider when formulating a value proposition, because it is so important to students. Within places, I guess we could also talk about campuses. What are you offering in terms of your facilities that nobody else is? And again, think about the direct benefit to the student of that. Another important aspect is your vision. So what is your vision as an institution? What is your role in society, or even in the world? And how do you help students find their place in it? Another point is reputation. So this is something to really dial up if you have an impressive track record that you want to shout about, and it's going to be appealing to students. Or conversely, if your rankings aren't up there with the big hitters, how does that position you differently? Not worse, but differently. Is there an element of kind of the underdog or a challenger brand that can come through in your value proposition? And finally, your networks. So this is a super interesting one to me, because when we compare university brands to more household name brands, 99% of people don't know you or care about you, as savage as that sounds. But on the flip side of that, the ones that do, the ones that have studied with you and been on a journey with you, they do care, and they care a lot. Your value proposition only really exists to your students in a kind of ephemeral space, you know, the 3 to 5 year stage of someone's life where they learn with you. So the networks they build in that time at your institution are going to be crucial in ensuring your brand and its values kind of live on through your alumni. Your network are your brand advocates and your evangelists even. So it's really important to consider when you're thinking about value. So that's a brief overview of the ingredients, the things to consider when creating a value proposition itself. And this is another kind of definition. So simply put, your value proposition is this. And I think it's a much nicer way of putting it than that kind of dry, boring dictionary definition from earlier. It's a promise that you make to your prospective students based on the value you know, and that's a really important word, you know you can add to their lives. I wanted to talk you through some value propositions from outside of the education space, from brands that I think are totally nailing it. The first is from Uber, whose value proposition is that it's the smartest way to get around. In this little boilerplate piece of copy here, so tap the app, get a ride, Uber is the smartest way to get around. One tap and a car comes directly to you, your driver knows exactly where to go, and payment is completely cashless. They managed to sum up exactly what their service is, what the benefits are, while also taking kind of a shot at the competition or the alternative. You know, everything they mention is geared around convenience, and hailing a cab in New York City offers literally none of these things listed, but they don't have to say that. So that's a really strong, clear, functional value proposition. Another one that I absolutely love is this from IKEA, who in those 3 simple words managed to communicate so much. The line here is the wonderful everyday. It doesn't just talk about something as banal as flat pack furniture, it really talks about the world you create around it. Their messaging brings you into their story, and it kind of evokes feelings of home or a sense of place or family even. While the Uber proposition is smart and functional, and it speaks to kind of the rational side of your brain, this is kind of all about emotion and storytelling. And as a copywriter, I think it's really kind of admirable how they've managed to say it all in so few words. But let's bring this back to the sector. I want to talk to you about some work we did for Carnegie Mellon University at the back end of last year. We were tasked with coming up with a kind of fresh proposition for their Integrated Innovation Institute, which I found out over several client calls is quite hard to say out loud. The school basically brings together expertise from 3 different disciplines, so engineering, design, and business. And it's really where innovators of the future go to get going, to start the doing, as it were. So myself and my colleague Elliot, who's the senior creative at NetNative, came up with this idea of making next happen now. And with it, we kind of wanted to speak to people who are impatient for change, who don't want to wait for the next kind of world-changing innovation, the next Uber to just happen. They wanted to be the ones that made it happen. They wanted to be the ones that invented it. So to get this across, we wanted bold, kind of active messaging and a visual style that, for me, kind of really encapsulates what innovation is all about. You know, it's that scribbling out and starting again. It's reworking. It's the idea of if at first you don't succeed, try again. It's like a continual process, which I think comes through in the visuals here. Oh. So this is really a case of understanding our audience and having a really good relationship with the client, the value of a creative strategy that went into this kind of work. I think it's a really good example of a clear and rational and emotive value proposition. And that was just an example of how it feeds through into the visuals and the messaging further along in a campaign. Okay, so moving on to the why. Why do we need a value proposition? Well, I'm just going to run these numbers by you quickly. In the UK, there are 130 universities, which seems like a lot to us. But that number is really dwarfed by the number of colleges in the US, is over 3,500. But even if we go a bit more granular than that and take a look at one specific type of program, in the US, there are over 1,000 MBA programs to choose from. So the competition in numbers alone is pretty fierce. But let's take an MBA as an example. They're pretty expensive programs. The fundamentals and the skills you pick up while studying on one will remain largely the same from provider to provider. But there are differences, and communicating those differences clearly is going to be key in getting students to choose you over someone else. I know we spoke at length earlier about our work for NYU Stern, but I think it really reinforces the point here too. We knew we could rely quite heavily on the prestige of the Stern brand. We could get that to do some of the heavy lifting for us, but that only appeals to the rational side, right? For us, a difference here is the balance you get when you mention EQ in the same breath as IQ, and when you use human qualities to offset the kind of functional business skills element of studying on an MBA.
Discover a different degree of experience in NYU Stern's executive MBA program.
I actually have gained more confidence to say, you know what, I'm just not learning about business, but I could hopefully help to run a business.
I came in as an expert and quickly learned that I had a lot to learn.
I came in thinking, I'm going to learn and I'm going to, be a business person. And instead, I just became a better person overall.
Are you open to excellence? Prove it and apply now.
Cool. So hopefully the sound worked on that this time around. But yeah, moving on to your audiences, really, it's important to keep in mind where they are, not just physically, but mentally. Where are they mentally at the moment after such a tumultuous year? The pandemic has changed everything, not least for students. And when we say everything, we mean everything. We know from research we've been undertaking in the past year or so that many providers are pivoting to online study. In turn, students' overall outlook on education in the UK and in the US has changed during COVID. And of course, students are spending more time online during lockdowns. That kind of makes sense, right? This data is particularly revealing from our Student Pulse survey. It shows that 17% of all students, which in this instance is a pretty high number considering, are spending 6 hours a day on social media apps. 6 hours a day is quite a long time to be on a social media app. But I'm going to hit you with one more number, which for me is the most staggering one. And it's this. It's 1.5 seconds. So 1.5 seconds of all of that screen time and all of that time spent online. You have 1.5 seconds to win attention from your audience, or build a connection with your audience, or drive meaningful action from your audience. They're busy people, they've got busy feeds. 1.5 seconds isn't a great deal of time. So I guess the lesson here is make that time count. Communicate your own unique value proposition in as clear a way as you can. So we've covered the what and the why. Now let's talk a little bit about when we speak up. So with everything that's happening in the world, everything that's happened over the past year or so, COVID-19, the US election, the tragic death of George Floyd and the subsequent BLM protests thereafter, the various women's marches that have taken place, the temptation for brands and universities and institutions to speak up on these cultural issues is always there. But there's definitely an element of walking the walk before you talk the talk, which I think Murray referenced in his first talk this morning. It really rings true here. If we take Blackout Tuesday as an example, plenty of universities posted the black square on their Instagram page, but very few followed up, or at least followed up visibly. These are just some quotes from students of color for whom simply posting a black square wasn't enough. So these are some of the things they said. I feel like they're just too passive on it. I want to see something active. All I've seen in response to BLM from the university is a post on Twitter for Blackout Tuesday and a few retweets, which feels very much like performative activism to me. The university pays lip service to diversity. It's not enough. And it's true, right? Posting something on Instagram that takes all of 2 seconds doesn't communicate your value proposition at all unless you can back it up with action. So you can really see the pitfalls of trying to speak up without having done the work previously, or at least done the work visibly. Something quite pertinent at the moment in Pride Month, happy Pride Month, everyone, is a conversation around corporate rainbow washing. So every year, like clockwork, big brands around the world incorporate the rainbow into their logo. And some of the brands, like Gap on this slide, for example, they've got a long and storied history of allyship and supporting the LGBTQ plus communities, but others don't, or at least visibly they don't. So this, like the black square, kind of comes off a bit cynical to smart, savvy students. Who are your audiences? They're smart people. They can see through this kind of thing quite quickly. And yeah, I think that it's just a case of making it visible, the work you're doing. I read this really simple quote on one of my favorite copywriters' feeds the other day, Vicky Ross. And it says, if brands change their logo to show their support for a cause or community, they should change their slogan to say how they're actually being supportive. I love how simple that is. It's such a quick win for brands to just go that extra inch and communicate how they're supporting various causes, not just that they are. You know, most, if not all, universities do have policies in place for the protection of marginalized groups. So think about how you can bring that to the fore in your comms. How can you show that you're walking the walk before you talk the talk, so that talking the talk becomes a much easier exercise? I'd just like to quickly show you some work we did for NYU Silver School of Social Work, which is a school that most definitely does walk the walk in terms of their social impact. This is a campaign put together by our lead creative, Georgia, and our senior copywriter, Freya, which I think channels that feeling of kind of activism in the air into a really smart campaign. So the campaign is called Show Up with Silver. And it was all about the idea of showing up, standing up and being counted and fighting for what's right. In the more proactive comms, you can see here, we wanted bold and kind of highly branded creative. We wanted it to look and read like something that wouldn't look too out of place on a placard or a sign at a protest. So being on the right side of history takes nerve. Join the fight with a master's in social work. Show up with Silver. And that actually translated really nicely into the more reactive content we produced. So our messaging is around community action and social impact. And these Instagram polls asking kind of big provocative questions were kind of perfectly aligned with Silver's value proposition. They really helped us to engage the audience early on and invite them into the conversation rather than just talking at them. It didn't come across preachy. It was actually asking for opinions and starting a conversation. So I guess the lesson here is your brand proposition should be strong enough to work for both proactive and reactive comms. But if you are going to do reactive comms, back up what you're saying with truth. Cool. Moving on to the how. So my favorite bit as a copywriter, how do we say it? How do we communicate our value proposition in our words and in our imagery? I wanted to bring up this ad that Burger King ran late last year in the UK when we were entering our third lockdown. It's a digital ad that reads, "There's more to life than the Whopper. There's Roti King, Sultan's Palace, Tayab's, Eco, Dumplings Legend, Oatchi's, Damak Platsky. In short, there are many great dishes from thousands of restaurants that deserve to be as famous as the Whopper. As we head into tier 3 across most parts of the country, it's clear independent restaurants need all our support. So we've decided to give you a break from our burger picks and make our Instagram available to all these restaurants. Until they can reopen, they can advertise on our Instagram for free. Friends from the hospitality industry, if you want to share your signature dish on Instagram, post it with Whopper and Friends." So whatever your thoughts are on Burger King as a brand or as a restaurant, this is pretty cool, right? The restaurants they're name checking, they're hyper local to London, and you'd only really have heard about them if you lived in certain parts of London. But for me, it's not so much what they're saying or doing, it's how they say it that strikes a chord with me. It's reactive content that's effective, not just because what they're saying, but how they say it. And this is really a lesson in consistency. Burger King's brand tone of voice has always had the air of an underdog about it. And whether that's to do with an inferiority complex with other fast food places or not, I don't know. But they write copy with the handbrake off. They're not afraid to be funny or witty or irreverent, or to use terms that are already out there in the culture, like woke, for example, in that ad for the Rebel Whopper. But they're playful and they're human, and I think that's a really key attribute to have if you want to be memorable. This is from last week, and it's something which I think really encapsulates a lot of what we've been talking about so far. It's a kind of less than subtle dig at Chick-fil-A and their stance on Pride Month. So what they're doing is they're donating to an LGBTQ plus charity with every chicken burger sold. They're doing something tangible, which is really important. That is backing it up. But the tone of voice here remains playful and provocative and kind of informal, which I really like. You're probably thinking at this stage, what do burgers have to do with communicating your university value proposition? And really, it's simple. It's to do with tone of voice. It's about consistency in your tone of voice. So a strong, consistent tone of voice, how you read and sound, is your most valuable asset in standing out from the crowd and being remembered. And I think that's the key thing here. It's being remembered. The last piece of work I'd like to show you was part of a big rebranding project we undertook with the Swedish Institute and their education brand study in Sweden. And we came up with a proposition called the Swedish Way. Part of my remit on this project was to work alongside their team on the tone of voice that we devised, which really rested on these three super clear pillars: bold, playful, and informal. So it's just like Burger King, but instead of Whoppers, we're selling an entire country to go study in. So within those three pillars, we've got tools that help us articulate our tone of voice effectively. So when we say bold, we don't necessarily mean like big shouty copy. We mean telling the truth, and we mean asking big questions, and we mean mixing up the pacing and taking the edge off. When we say playful, and this again, this is something that won't sit right with many universities that are a bit more formal, but being playful is the ability to laugh at yourself in your copy, laugh at your competitors in a sort of playful way like Burger King have, and really making the serious stuff fun. There's a lot of serious stuff at university that needs to be handled seriously, but there's also a lot of stuff that isn't, that could be a lot more engaging if it was dealt with a bit of humor. And informal, be free of bullshit. Write like you talk to a friend. This is something that we really encourage each other to do in the copy team at Net Natives. If you're writing something and you can feel it reads a bit mechanical, we'll just encourage each other to just have a conversation about it, say it out loud. If it sounds like something you say to a friend or to a student, then you're probably along the right lines. And then the final point on an informal tone of voice is to be zeitgeisty. So check in with what's going on in the culture. Be brave enough to engage in those sorts of conversations. Be relevant, basically. The one thing we workshop this tone of voice with the people who would be using it in their everyday roles, so marketers and content creators at Study in Sweden, at the Swedish Institute. And the one thing they've consistently said is how freeing it felt to be able to write like a human being. And I think there's a lot to that. All too often universities kind of speak in the passive voice, or they talk too much about themselves without considering, you know, the person on the other side of the screen. And that's something we were really keen to subvert with our tone of voice for Study in Sweden. We wanted it to be bold, playful, and informal. We wanted it to read like a human being has written it. And as you can see from their homepage, it's really kind of followed through into every single touch point for them. That tone of voice works so well with these kind of striking visuals and use of emojis. It's not what you'd expect to see when looking at places to study, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's its strength, its differentiator, which is for me the best way to communicate a value proposition, is to be different. It allowed us, the tone of voice really allowed us to talk about big societal issues that Sweden are really progressive on, so that Sweden really cares about as a country, like the environment, gender equality, LGBTQ plus issues. Here we've got some examples of the tone of voice in action in some creative. So we're using punchy copy with plenty of adjectives to really paint a picture of what it's like to live and learn in Sweden with that middle one. So it's the open, fair, green, equal, queer, free, smart, the Swedish way. And on the right hand side there, it's an example of it's not rainbow washing per se, but it's like, how can you use a rainbow in a subtle way that's fun and feels not forced. Here we've got some more examples of how that tone of voice comes through in a really copy-led ad here. So, hey, you want to live and learn the Swedish way. Liberating, innovating, planet-saving, caretaking, world-changing, awareness-raising, pride flag waving, nature-loving, work-life balancing, gender redefining Swedish way. So using a really playful lexicon there to kind of get across the entire experience. But also kind of to offset that, some quite serious posts. So welcome to Sweden, where women work on things like reinventing biofuels, reducing global warming, winning seed funding, or whatever they want. You know, we don't just want to be telling people that Sweden's a really accepting culture for people of all shapes and sizes. We want it to be backed up with facts. I just really wanted to read this out as well. This is an excerpt from a blog post that they did themselves, the Study in Sweden brand, based on the tone of voice toolkit that we gave them. And it's so nice to see how much of it has come through into their everyday writing. This is an excerpt from a blog about finding housing in Sweden as a student, which is a notoriously difficult process with lots of red tape and admin to get through. But the opening paragraph of it really got me. It was like, congratulations, you found out you've been accepted into your program and you're officially studying in Sweden. You celebrated with your friends, you cried with your parents. Finally, your dream is about to come true. But then, dun, 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 you realize, shit, you have to figure out where you have to live. So again, taking something quite practical, like IKEA, no coincidence, and rational, and applying layers and layers of personality to it that appeal to a whole different side of your audience, you know, their emotional side rather than their rational side. And a good tool that this uses, I think, is the use of specificity, so the feeling of it. So it talks about really kind of visceral emotions, so like crying with your parents, celebrating with your friends. I think that really adds a layer of personality to the writing, and it feels like a person has written it rather than a super serious study brand. And again, going back to the point around backing up what you're saying with truth and integrity, this tone of voice really allowed us to do that. So in these ads, we're focusing on the LGBTQ plus community, but we're not just showing our audience like rainbow-clad Swedes at Stockholm Pride, which is one of the biggest in Europe. That will be too easy. We're utilizing the space here in the body copy to kind of prove it. So this reads, did you know that Sweden was the first country to give transgender folks the right to change their legal gender? It's all part of how things are done here. The open way, the fair way, the Swedish way. So again, we're showing and we're telling, and I think that's a really effective tool to be using. Obviously, this kind of tone of voice won't be fit for all universities. Some are more conservative than others, and you are, after all, places of learning. But I think the lesson here is that that's not to say that you can't play with perceptions a little bit along the way. Like I said, this isn't the kind of content you'd really expect from a brand that represents an entire country as an international study destination. But again, I think that really acts as its strength rather than a weakness. It's a really strong differentiator. And they communicate their value proposition so well. I should probably quickly mention this. With tone of voice, there's one common pitfall. Just because you're talking to students doesn't mean you should try and talk like students. Literally no good comes from this. If anything, it dilutes your value proposition, and you don't want to be the Steve Buscemi meme. So, yeah. So, some key takeaways. I've whizzed through this, I'm sorry. Some key takeaways from this are that competition is fierce and its attention spans are short. So, you've really got to make every second and every communication count. And I mean every little part of an ad. You know, is the body copy doing something that the creative isn't? Always try and appeal to both the rational and the emotional sides of your audience. So the head and the heart. I think that both really need to be considered when you're communicating your value proposition. If you're going to stand for something, make sure you can back it up. Again, super important. We've seen the reactions from students that don't feel like their institutions are backing it up, or at least visibly. Be yourself and be clear. I think you know your brand better than anyone. You should, in theory, be able to communicate it in the clearest way possible. You have 1.5 seconds to do so. So utilize your tone of voice and visual identity to truly stand out. And this last one, so play with people's perceptions of your sector or your university even. Don't always do the obvious. Surprise people, it makes it memorable. I think that's about it from me. So again, thank you so much to everyone who's worked really tirelessly to organise this great event, to all the speakers and to all of you for tuning in. here's hoping next year's event will be in person. Stick around for the Meet the Speakers event in a little while, when everyone who's spoken today will be on hand to answer any questions you have about anything you've seen over the course of the day. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.